Good morning. To kick off the final day of the festival, we have a star panel of some of India's most talented young non-fiction writers. It's an odd thought, looking back 20, 30 years, that when the Indian writing in English bandwagon first kicked off with the opening of Penguin India and the beginning of commercial English language publishing in this country as late as the 1980s, the writing that was being produced was overwhelmingly fiction. The writers who were famous, the new generation that appeared, Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, Vikram Sampath, and so on, all wrote novels. And from that period, Indian writing in English in fiction was winning every prize internationally. There was a period in the 80s and early 90s when almost every year there was a major Indian writer on the Booker shortlist. But surprisingly, for the first 15, 20 years of that, there was no parallel rise of Indian non-fiction. And to this date, there has only ever been one Indian shortlisted for the prize, which is the non-fiction equivalent of the Booker, which used to be called the Samuel Johnson, now known as the Baillie Gifford. Ram Guha was long-listed for his cricket book about 20 years ago, and Samant Subramaniam's Sri Lanka book was shortlisted. But it's still quite a striking contrast that, in sense, the Indian fiction first 11 is still a world-beating team, but the Indian non-fiction team is still sort of struggling with Afghanistan against relegation. We have with us three of the people who are beginning to change that with a series of remarkable books, which in a sense have been written against the current. When we were discussing this panel in the author's room just beforehand, we all shared experiences that we'd all had with people being slightly baffled by what we were writing. All of our non-fiction books, all of which have taken years of research in different archives and reading through letters and manuscripts and previous books written on this and years of research, are quite routinely described as novels, which is irritating if you just spent 5 years in a dusty archive having your ankles nibbled by mosquitoes. You could have just sat at home by the pool or sort of, gone out to some nice spot and written it from your imagination, rather than slogging away in the archives. So it's still an oddly new genre that all of us here are writing in. And this is different from other countries. It's still an odd fact of Indian publishing that if you go into a Waterston's or a big American bookshop, most of the best-selling books will be non-fiction. That's beginning to be the case here, but it's only just happening. Overwhelmingly for years, people were, if they were interested in books, they were interested in fiction. This is changing very slowly, but it is changing. And every year, new non-fiction writers are coming up. The writers on this panel particularly specialize in biography. Again, a genre which historically India has been oddly lacking in. By historically, I mean looking at the very long term. If you look at the Islamic world, and if you look at Europe, or if you look at Japan or even China, ancient literature is full of biographical writing, first person or autobiographical or biographical. Lives of great men, whether Marcus Aurelius, whether Tacitus writing lives of the Caesars in the Roman period, or early Chinese historiography, you have very detailed portraits of great men, but nothing equivalent exists in ancient India. And I think I'm right in saying that probably the first autobiography of an Indian historical character would be Babur. Is there anything before that anyone could think of? It's not a genre which, for some reason, this country has excelled. And I don't know the reasons for that. It's an interesting question to ask why this country is so rich, for example, in poetry, or gemology, or astrology, or theology and philosophy, did not produce biography. But that is the case. So first of all, I'm going to ask Vikram, as probably the first entrant into the field among us, other than myself, as a different elderly generation. What made you first turn to non-fiction as opposed to the novel? And did you feel you were fighting against the tide when you did so?
Thanks, William. I think it's almost impossible for me to write fiction because I can't write about emotions. And I think fiction does prevaricate that necessity. History came very easily to me, and I started off with, actually, it was not a biography, but a collection of several biographies, the 600 years of the Mysore royal family, the Wadeyars, which was my first book, and which further led to related books. The biography of the first Indian to record her voice on the gramophone, this fascinating woman called Gauhar Jan, who recorded in 1902, and then, of course, later biographies.
Using what technology? Wax?
The wax, shellac, there's 78 RPMs. I've always called biography, as a love affair. And I think it begins that way. You fall in love with the subject initially, and unless you do that...
Sounding ominous, it begins that way. Does it end in divorce at the end, or...?
They can be. I mean, there've been several such broken relationships for me as well, and I'm sure for everyone on this panel, where, it has to start with that kind of an interest in the subject that you're talking about, because you're going to then invest, as you said, several years in the archives and your time, emotions, money, and so on. And somewhere in the course of that, and the biographer and the subject, I think they share a very unique relationship. The person is either dead or relatively undateable, but still you are planning to date this person for the next few years. And over the next few years, you become just like it happens in a love affair, I think you chase your love. Every letter that is written to them, from them, you rummage, and you probably get to know a lot more about your subject than the subject perhaps themselves knows. And in the course of it, sometimes there can be disillusionment, you can move away from it, which has happened, I'm sure, for several of us. But I think most importantly, the final stage of the biography is perhaps the most important, where after investing yourself so much emotionally with the subject, when you're writing it or committing it to paper, you have to cut yourself off emotionally, because then there's a very thin line between a biography and a hagiography. And having that emotional disconnect with a person you love is going to be very difficult, where you also bring the warts and all of the person and their faults. So I think that, to me, is one of the most critical and also the most difficult task for any biographer.
Vikram, I think you're luckily alone among us on this panel by having had a rather extreme form of literary criticism in the form of having your effigy burnt. Could you talk a little about this?
Oh, my good Lord. Well, so my book on the Wadeyars, obviously in that there's also an entire section on Tipu Sultan, and you know how Tipu Sultan can also polarize opinion like many other characters of Indian history. So it becomes very difficult, I think, in India today, which only survives on binaries, and the nuance that history and historiography needs is something that is completely lacking today. You're immediately pigeonholed and boxed into some ideological bucket all the time.
Shivaji good, Aurangzeb devil.
No, I mean, even that, you're called upon to take positions, and as a historian or a biographer, a label is immediately put on you. So, I mean, Tipu Sultan is a historian's enigma, and he presents multiple shades of opinion to different people. I mean, you can be good and bad. They need not be just he's good, he's bad. Tipu, for instance, in Kerala, many people hate him. So do people in Coorg and Malabar, the conquest of Malabar that Tipu had. But then in different parts of Mysore state, he also gave grants to temples and so on.
Padshah Lingams.
Yes. Yeah. So this in this time when you're called upon to take a very decisive, the Arnab Goswami style of debate in 30 seconds. Tell me yes or no, yes or no. And so history and biography, I don't think work that way, where you really need to have that nuance. So my whole exposition on Tipu, presenting both sides of the picture. And he was a politician, he was not a saint. So at sometimes he ran with the hare and hunted with the hounds. He was extremely oppressive to the Syrian Christians, to the Nayars of Malabar, to the Kurgis, to the Mandya Mayangars, but at the same time he also gave these grants to the Sringeri Mutt and so on. But just writing all of this created such a furor that copies of my book were burnt in Bangalore, my effigy was burnt, and there were demands that I withdraw these aspects which talk about the so-called showing Tipu in a bad light. So I think that is also the problem, as you mentioned, where we have appropriated these symbols. You can't write an objective biography of an Ambedkar today because he has been appropriated by one community, a Periyar, a Shivaji, a Tipu. So there's vote bank which have appropriated each of these icons, and I think in the process, history becomes the casualty where you can't script narratives true to the archive.
The most dramatic case of that being James Lane and
Shivaji.
Manu, do you want to just talk about that for a second? What happened?
James Lane reference is funny actually, because when I did my second book and I referred to his work in that, I sent it to a very, very senior scholar at a foreign university. And he read it, he loved the book, etc. And then he wrote back to me saying, but are you sure you want James Lane in your bibliography? Because you live in Maharashtra, you grew up in Maharashtra, you never know when some group of madmen, it may not be now, it may be 20 years later, that they'll go and pick up a reference, then they'll say you've offended our sentiments, by quoting a controversial man. Even, since Vikram gave the example of Tipu Sultan, even in Malabar, Tipu Sultan's actions are very complicated, because I was speaking to Jaya Jetli yesterday. She's descended from the family of the Rajas of Kolangod near Palakkad, and she was telling me that in their family temple inside Kolangod Palace, there's the plinth on which the deity is kept was donated by Tipu Sultan, given by his orders. In Irunalakuda, there's this Nambudri family who were Sangamagrama Madhava, the great medieval mathematicians' descendants. In their temple, their family temple, you see two Dwarapalakas outside the shrine missing arms because those were cut off by Tipu Sultan soldiers. So in the same province, you're seeing multiple versions of the man. There are obviously, in today's India, and it must have been even more difficult earlier, but increasingly with greater communication, people hearing more about your books. Otherwise, the reading audience was relatively small. Now news carries much more quickly. So yeah, I've never had an effigy burnt, and I think Vikram was only 27 or something when that happened, so I can imagine how shocking that
Still
would have been.
many years for all of us to have our effigies burnt.
It'll happen inevitably, don't worry. As I said, you better watch out for your visa, given your opinions these days on Twitter.
I have a large Tipu Sultan section in the Anarchy, so I'll disguise that in my talk this evening.
Yeah, but I've only faced a lawsuit, really. They sent me a legal notice, tried to bare their fangs. I bared mine.
Who did?
And then, I bared my fangs in response, and then that went away very quietly.
But who sent the legal notice about
I don't know if I should name them, but let's say it was connected to my first book.
Achha.
And then, they sent a rather poorly worded legal notice. And I said, look, I'm not divining any of this out of thin air. This is all archival material. The references are given. Go look it up if you like. Plus, of course, some firm language from my part also about not budging an inch. And then I think they went away rather quietly.
Manu, while we're with you, as well as having the difficulty of vote banks and so on, potentially infuriated by anything that's not immediately black and white, there's also a certain amount of suspicion of biography, perhaps oddly, in some sections of Indian academia. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think here we haven't quite bridged that, in the sense that in the West, as you yourself know, biography as a medium of telling history is a pretty popular method. It makes a lot of sense because...
But also, not popular not just in the sense of people enjoy reading it, but also respectable academically, and academics write biographies.
And with good reason, for the simple reason that, what is a biography? You're trying to unveil a mind, you're trying to peel back the layers and understand a mind. And if you're talking about history, every mind is in a way a microcosm of an entire period, of an entire society, of all the impulses and cultural trends that were happening each mind was shaped by all these things around them. So for me, telling history through the lives of an interesting person is actually wonderful, because you can actually relate to it far better than if you just make it devoid of all human emotion and turn it into a few dates and battles, because human experience is what makes history come alive, and human experience is the reality of history.
Have you found skepticism about your work from the Indian historical establishment?
It's odd, like a lot of senior scholars are extremely supportive. So the Sahitya Academy Award came from a very distinguished panel of senior scholars. The second book was reviewed in an academic journal, in a peer-reviewed academic journal. So it's earned its stripes in that sense. But I do note that, some of my contemporaries, people closer to me in age, are sometimes a little... They're like, no, why are you doing popular history? That's a bad thing. And I have one foot in the world of academia. I'm doing my PhD. So a lot of my colleagues in the PhD universe they frown on this whole idea of doing popular history in any way.
I did an essay in the New York Review of Books 10 years ago about the war on history, the different views of the past held by, say, the Congress and the BJP, and the whole question of textbooks and so on. And I concluded that essay with the observation that one of the reasons, in a sense, that there is such polarized and ignorant discussion of history out there is that Indian academics seem to refuse to engage at a popular level. I mean, to give you an example from the West, our star speaker at the Jaipur Literature Festival later this week is Stephen Greenblatt. Now, Greenblatt is probably the world's greatest living Shakespearean. He's won every academic award. He's the main professor of English at Harvard. He is as respectable an academic, gold standard Shakespearean. But he's written a book called The Swerve that was at the #1 of the New York Times bestseller list for 7 months. It's a book on the beginning of the Renaissance. It's a short book of about 200 pages saying about how one European monk's discovery of a manuscript in a small library in Central Europe transformed our understanding of the Renaissance and the rediscovery of the classical past. Now, as yet, there is no Indian equivalent to Stephen Greenblatt.
There are
Ram,
Indian
I suppose,
academics who work abroad who are willing to do this. If you've noticed, Supriya Gandhi's book on Darashuko, for example, it's written for a layman. It's written for an intelligent reader. She's an academic in the Western space. I think that's why she's open to the idea. Whereas academics who live here sometimes are not necessarily open to the idea of engaging with anybody beyond the seminar circuit, which is, I think, a tragedy, because there's such wonderful stories here. And on the one hand, we complain about how kids don't understand history and everything's getting convoluted and misunderstood. On the other hand, we're not really making an effort to reach out and bridge that gap. And when people try and do that, there's a lot of nastiness that comes their way. But,
there is also, I don't want to sound like Amit Shah, but there is also a problem, I think, in that Indian history departments traditionally have been so dominated by Marxist thought, which disapproves of biographical approaches to history. History is seen as not as great men shaping history, but as economic forces invisibly channeling all our lives. And for people brought up in that tradition, biography is actually kind of anathema. It's a kind of naivety about the past. Don't you understand? It's all about how the economy was changing, the wider currents of economic and social growth, not about a great man like Napoleon directing his hussars to attack on a frontal attack in a particular battle. And so those that do write about great men, or even ordinary men, are somehow considered suspect by the establishment. Do you find that? I mean, you're slightly more towards the right than some of us.
Well, I'm right in the center, neither on the right, neither on the left. So I think that's a very important point that you brought out, which I think the polarization in Indian historiography, and it's a tragedy that even during the British times, on the one hand, you had the Orientalist, William Jones and others who had this whole, romanticized idea of India, the Royal Society of Bengal and all of that. On the one hand, then you had the colonialists, the missionary kind of historians whose idea was also to deride Indian traditions. But you had a huge band of so-called nationalist historians who came largely from Maharashtra and Bengal, the V.K. Rajwade, Bhandarkar, Jadunath Sarkar, R.C. Majumdar. In colonial India, our historians could actually write unbiased history, whereas in independent India, it's not possible. And I think I heard you saying somewhere that world over you have a conservative view to all disciplines, particularly in the humanities, whereas in India, it's not that there aren't many, but there hasn't been an ecosystem that's been created, or they've been gatekeepers of the system who have actually precluded anybody who holds a differing opinion. And ironically, this started more from the 1970s with the establishment of the Indian Council of Historical Research, ICHR, which ensured that only one dominant ideology found its place here. So where is the Neil Ferguson here who's going to
It's a problem I have when I'm programming Jaipur, because in most countries in almost all countries, writers tend towards the left.
Yeah.
The great majority of writers will be left-leaning in some way. But there will be right-wing historians, and they will be sensible, respectably academic figures who dissent from what is usually the majority opinion. In India, 90% of writers are of the left. And there is a very, very small group of right-wing academics and writers, and in a sense, in a country where you do have a democratically elected right-wing government, you can't really justify not having right-wing voices. But as elsewhere, and in the West, you do have objections to right-wing voices. Should you, for example, the question: should you give a platform to the RSS? Is that something that you should do, as in a sense, the power behind the throne? Or should you regard them as beyond the pale and not invite them? These questions are interesting. Anyway, Parvati, to move to a different end you came to non-fiction and biography from a background in fiction.
Yes.
Unlike all of us. Did that lead to a different methodology, to a different way of approaching your great Jahangir biography?
I guess, I think, you know what, I think one of the things that you need as a writer of fiction is a character. That's half your battle done when you have a good character. And I started researching Jahangir. I wasn't sure whether I was going to write about him or not. And I started reading his biography. And I'd only read a few pages, and I knew that I was going to really enjoy this man. You know, I mean, he starts off, almost in the first page, there's these sort of 12 promulgations that he makes at the beginning of his reign. And all very worthy, you know, hospitals and good orders, and banning the sale of alcohol and drugs. And then parenthetically he states, I myself, however, have been drinking since I was 18. And this, you know, this sort of nice. So this was a man, I mean, this is a man of many contradictions, a very rich, meaty character to get into, and he allowed me, and he is a person who has been seen in many, many different ways. So he has, first of all, his own memoirs, which are wonderfully lucid, very well written, seemingly very unself-conscious, even confessional. Although they are also read as, somebody has called them a sort of a model of imperial propaganda, that they were in fact intended to portray Jahangir in a certain light. Even when he, for example, confesses to the murder of Abul Fazl, he is not confessing to murder, he is confessing to strength, to having had the strength to eliminate opposition. And he's portrayed in the writings of Abul Fazl himself, who was his great, who disliked him intensely, who goes from first calling him the sort of the pearl of the dominion when he's born, to calling him the pleasure-loving prince when his excessive drinking begins to hamper his ability to govern or conquer or lead armies or anything. Then he's seen in the writings of Thomas Roe, where he emerges as this, you know, extremely affable, yet sort of henpecked man. This image that continues for 400 years of, you know, Jahangir as a man who's dominated by his wife Noor Jahan.
The real power. The
real power. Although that is contradicted in his own writings. And then he's seen, you know, through the art that's generated in his time.
He doesn't mention Roe once. Roe writes hundreds of pages about Jahangir, and Jahangir totally ignores this mission.
Yeah, so he exists, and then finally exists in the art, in his portraits, and the portraits that are made of him, in which, you know, he's shown in all these different ways. Looking at that portrait of the Madonna, most famously, conversing with his sort of Hindu guru, Brahmin guru, this Jadrup Gosen, or performing these miraculous tasks, almost suggesting himself as a kind of avatar of Vishnu. So
and the millennial sovereign.
Millennial sovereign, exactly. So he was just this character with so many dimensions and so much. And so many interpretations of him also that existed, that it was just a joy for me to.
But did you ever consider writing him as a historical novel? I mean, there is a separate genre, of course, of fictionalized. Of novel writing, which is based on a historical character. For example, Robert Graves' I, Claudius.
Right. Yeah,
where you have Robert Graves was a considerable classicist. He knew the sources, but he chose to write about Claudius in a fictional manner.
That is one of my absolute favorite books of all time. I would love one day perhaps to write some kind of historical fiction like that. But no, I never considered. I think I attended a talk by a historian once who said that she was planning to write fiction next. And she said she wants to write one book without footnotes. And I think for me it was the exact opposite. I wanted to write a book with footnotes. I just loved it. I loved the research, I loved the reading, I loved the fact that the narrative or the fact that the story existed, or I had to piece it together. I didn't have to invent it. I could play with what existed. It was like putting pieces of a jigsaw together. It was a completely different exercise for the brain, and it was a very, very, very enjoyable for me. Therefore, so.
Which brings us to methodology and actually the writing of these sorts of books. Vikram, do you want to kick off? What's your method when you begin? You decide you want to write about Gohajan, for example. Yeah. How do you collate your material? What's your?
I wish there was a simple rule for that. Particularly Gohar Jan, for instance, I came across her completely by accident. As I said, she was the first superstar of the country to record, but then she had died in anonymity in Mysore. She stayed there. She was the first superstar and diva who used to throw parties for 10,000 when her cat gave birth to kittens and so on, and go all over Calcutta in her buggy, for which she even agreed to pay 1,000 rupees fine a day to the viceroy, as goes the apocryphal tale. Obviously, and also being a courtesan at Tavaif, she also fell in love with all the wrong men who cheated her and embezzled her of her funds. So was left to literally die, in anonymity in the court of the Mysore Maharaja, which is where I discovered her. And then to trace her back through the entire, length and breadth of the country, where she was born in Azamgarh, to a British grandfather, a Hindu grandmother, an Armenian Christian father, was baptized at Allahabad in the Holy Trinity Church, and then converts to Islam, becomes a Tavaif, moves to Calcutta, becomes a courtesan in the court of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, and then when recording technology comes from London, she is the first one to actually negotiate with the Brits, the Europeans, and also charge something like 3,000 rupees per recording session. This is 1902 that I'm talking about, when she recorded first, and that was when the first Indian record was made. So this is a fascinating story in retrospect, but when I actually got into it, it was literally like looking for a needle in a haystack, because she was a Tavaif, there were no legal heirs, there were no students, there were nothing to fall back on. And I think an important part when you construct biographies in the Indian context is also to look at folklore, folk narratives. When I interviewed, musicians today, very eminent old senior musicians, most of them, since she was a Firang, the oft repeated tale was she was so fair that when she used to eat pan, all the red juice, you could see it go down her throat, almost making her seem like a water lizard rather than a human being. So, as a writer, you need to then sift off these things. In my other book, on Mysore, there was this very problematic theme of the curse of Talkad, which happened in the year 1610. So there's the Mysore Maharaja, who's also just the Mysore kingdom is on its way to being established, and there's a lot of skirmish with the Vijayanagar Empire, which is on its way out. And with the local viceroy in Vijayanagar, the Mysore king has a fight, he is killed, and then the king actually covets the jewels of the wife of the deceased viceroy. Her name is Alamelamma, and then he tries to send his armies to get those jewels. Now she refuses, and the story goes that she decks herself up completely in all these jewels, goes to this place in Talkad where the Kaveri is, and jumps into the river with this famous 3-line curse saying, the place that I am, Talakad, let it be completely submerged in sand. And the place where I've jumped in from, let there be a whirlpool, so that it always reminds this evil man, of the kind of things that he did. And the third and most ominous one was let the Mysore dynasty be completely wiped off. Let them not have children anymore. Now, this was 1610, but the dynasty continued, so what happened to the curse? Now, today, Talakad is a place on the banks of the Kaveri, which has more sand, perhaps, than in in the deserts of the Thar. You do have a whirlpool, and the Mysore kingdom has had a very crisscross genealogy. A natural-born son would have a son, but then next generation you have to adopt from the collateral line. Now this is almost
and then the near extinction under Tipu.
Yes.
When
young
the Duke
children
of
were
Wellington
killed.
claims that he found the heir of the Wadiyar kingdom in a kind of stable.
Yeah.
Is the
Yes.
word he uses.
But then this curse, this 3-line curse, Talakadu Malalagi, Malingi, Maduagi, Mysuru Maharajarige, Makkalagadiraali, it is almost chanted like a mantra in different parts of Mysore. And worse, the last Mysore, the king, if you can call him that, believed in this curse because he didn't have a child himself. Now here was I, who was a young man who also believed in scientific temper, who would not probably believe in these medieval curses and I tried to deduce, on the one hand, you put this folklore and respect the sentiment that goes of public belief, but also as a rational human being, you try to see what could be the the logic behind it. I traced the course of the Kaveri, which takes a turn around Talakad, and so geographically one side gets there is overflowing, the other side is exposed to sedimentation, and that's why you have sand, and the other side has a whirlpool. And interestingly, when I saw this whole curse episode has not been documented by any of the British or the French travelers, Francis Buchanan and others. And the first time her reference comes is way later in Rice's Gazette of Mysore, which shows that this was constructed to circumvent the doctrine of lapse, and to say that, we don't have children, but then it's not our fault. It's 200 years back. Some woman actually cursed us, and so please let us continue to rule, and the British wouldn't have any of it, and they deposed the king anyway in 1856. So when I actually narrated the folklore and also tried to rationalize it with a modern scientific temper, I won a lot of rage by the Mysore royal family, because they believed it. They wanted to construct a temple for this lady too. And the last king who died recently, he wanted to pray there so that he gets a son very soon. Now, and if you have a popular book which is coming and debunking that myth and saying this is fine, but then it also, this is the rationale behind it, that becomes very problematic. So the use of folklore and how much do you respect that folk tradition and the sentiments of the people and balance it also with a modern outlook, I think that becomes very difficult when it comes to methodology of writing.
Manu, your first book was an enormous tome. Was it 500 pages? 700 pages. How do you, just speaking in structural terms, how do you collate all that material? I mean, presumably there are 4 or 5 years of research, or 3 or 4 years of research going into that. How do you manage it? How do you bring it together? What's your methodology?
Because it was my first book, there was no method really when I went into it. The method took its shape, as time passed. I think the advantage, and this is why I admire Parvati's book very much, is that if your characters
how many
are
pages, the Jahangir? 253.
Not on the matter of pages, but because you see, the further back you go in time, your material becomes sparser. Understanding the material becomes more difficult. In my case, the advantage was that because the characters only died in the 80s, they were born in the 19th century, but they only died in the 1980s. There were reams and reams and reams and like hundreds of stacks of files that sort of allowed me to explore their story in great depth. Where at one time when they went and auctioned off all their palace stationery, that was recorded. How they ate, how many servants they had, how many people waited on them when they went for a bath, all of this was recorded. That, in fact, there was a surplus of data. The question was what you include and what you not include and what you discard. So, that was the challenge there. But what Vikram says is also true. The other factor was always interviews, because these people lived. Nurses who took care of them when they were old were still alive. People who knew them when they were slightly younger were still alive. People who knew them as children were alive. So you go and interview all these people, and everybody gives you a different perspective of each of these people. There's this, in Kerala, there's this great social reformer called Sri Narayana Guru. He was a contemporary of the protagonist of the book, and she respected him greatly, and he respected her greatly, but they never actually met. But there's a number of stories around this. One is that when Gandhiji came to meet her, at the end of the meeting, she said, "Don't you know there's another Mahatma in this city? You should go see him as well." And that's just a story. There's another amusing story told by some people on the Guru's side where they say the Rani was so keen to see him and that she one day sent a car to him. The Guru said, no, I'm not going to the palace in her car, and because he's a great Guru. So he stayed. But then equally, he wanted to give her a darshan, as it were. So he decided to go for a walk on the beach close to her palace. And the story goes, Rani saw it from her window, and then she ran out shouting, Guru, trying to call out to him. All very unlikely, because she was not the kind of person to run after somebody on the beach like that. And if she had, there would have been 300 servants following her. So that's more like an army charging at the Guru rather than anything else. But, I mean, the idea is each community, each segment that somehow is connected to her story has a different version of the same story. If you go further back in time, there are these moments, I forget the name of the Rajput king, but the Mughals defeat him, they come to the diplomatic table and they hammer out an agreement. In the Mughal record, they mention it, this was the battle, so many people died, we sort of hammered out this agreement. On the Rajput side, the same thing is converted into, this man was so great, he brought the Mughals to their knees, they had to come to the table and sign with him. Things like that. So each community, you see this even in the caste system. The same story, there's a famous Kerala king called Martandavarma. You went to his palace recently, Padmanabhapuram. There is an official narrative, which the upper caste groups say, but from the beginning there is a counter narrative where he is the villain of the story, told by these Villupaattu singers, the makers of these specific bows and so on in the Kanyakumari district. It's never codified anyway, but it's sung in songs every year for certain festivals, and he's the villain in that story. So you need to bring all of this sort of to the fore when you try and make sense of a character. And as I said, with Parvati, because it's further back in time, the challenge becomes even more real, because Jahangir lived in the 17th century, and here's Parvati in 2018-19 trying to decipher his mind.
Just to maybe mention my own methodology for collecting this material, when I moved from travel writing to history, I visited several of my contemporaries who were writing history books with a narrative base, and asked how they did it. And they all had a very similar method, which in case there's anyone in the audience who is thinking of writing these sorts of books, all of them used old-fashioned card indexes for their characters. So each character would have a file or a set of cards, and you'd number them. And as you did your research and these characters popped up, you'd add the references and so on, so that when you actually came to describe a character, when first introducing them in a narrative, you'd have all the material to hand and the references. On top of that, I have a dateline, which starts off always at 3 or 4 pages, and by the time I come to write is 300 or 400 or 500 pages long. And in that, I cut up the key quotes, not just the events, but the key quotes from the different... So if you're, for example, writing an account of the Battle of Plassey, you have there, the 7 or 8 different versions of of what happened, and you can mix and match it and take... in a sense, the fat is already boiled off, that you've chosen the most amusing and interesting and revealing sections. So that certainly I try and find that if I spend 5 years on a book, the first 1 or 2 is out in the archives gathering material. The second is pulling it all together into card indexes and so on. And then only at the very end do you spend 9 months actually writing the thing. And if you've spent long enough, I compare it to Chinese cooking in the sense that, you with Indian cooking, you're sitting there stirring your dal all day. But with Chinese cooking, you're spending years chopping up the blessed spring onions and marinating the lamb or whatever you're doing. And then you flash fry it very, very quickly and serve it. And hopefully, the dreadful thing with writing is if you get stuck and you don't know where you're going and you lose yourself, that's when the narrative begins to die and you lose people's interest. But if you can write it quickly, treat it like finals at university, when no parties, no drinking, up early, early to bed, straight into it the next day. And if you can live in it for a period of maybe 6 months, then you can produce something that's very fresh and very lively. Parvati, with your book, how did you I mean, there's always this view I find in India that history is boring. People hate their history classes at school. How did you keep your characters alive in the book? How did you make them lively enough to entrance and lead on the writer, lead on the reader?
Well, first, just to the earlier point, I just wanted to add a little thing. I was reading on the subject of methodology and how you write history. There's something I was reading by Mark Twain the other day, and he says a historian is somebody who sees the top half of a frog on a pond and can, because of his expertise or her expertise in physiognomy, can tell you what the bottom half is, can extrapolate. And it's all that sort of reading and researching and making of notes that allows you then, when you come to the writing, to start, extrapolating a little bit. And but for this question, William, I don't know. Actually, I would say it's a strange thing. I've noticed this in the time that I've written this and since it's come out, and also because I've written history for children, that on the one hand, when you go to school, or if I remember my own schooling in India, there were two subjects that were widely dreaded in school, and those were history and maths. And I think for similar reasons, because they were taught in abstractions. There was just a series of equations or numbers or dates or names. None of it really added up to anything. But on the other hand, it's also a strange contradiction that in the time that we live in now, post-school, history has become one of the most sort of controversial, polarizing subjects, to the extent that, sometimes it seems like people are fighting elections in the 16th century. That's, there's and so as a result, I found upon the publication of this book and the other books for kids that there is actually immense interest amongst readers now to read history and to discover for themselves what it is that we are what is it that we're arguing about? Who were these people? What was the what were the questions? Why are we discussing them with such agitation today? And so in that sense, in that sense, people were interested already. For myself, in terms of making them interesting, I think they just were. The Mughals generally are just too interesting for words. You have to sort of lessen sort of their color. They're so rich.
Manu, you've also managed to turn history into one of India's most popular columns, recently given up, but
yeah.
How does that work?
That was actually pretty challenging, because my first book got me used to the idea of writing 21,000 word chapters. So I had all the space I wanted, and I produced a 700-page book, which I intend never to do again. And then having to produce and sort of put an entire story together in 1,000 words, or sometimes 950 words, because there's an image that has to go, and then they wouldn't compromise on the size of the image, and then I had to compromise on the words. And it came with challenges, because you do end up feeling that there could have been more nuance, or the argument could have been made in a slightly more polished fashion, but it's not always possible. So the issue was, am I looking at sort of making sure that the research is super solid and all of that? Yes. But when I communicate it, who's a newspaper reader? It's a completely different target audience. The paper, it was a Saturday edition, but the main paper was a business paper. So I thought, okay, that is the sort of trade-off. In my books, I can do the footnotes and the citations and the proper sort of, marking up of things and the sources and all that. But in the paper, it becomes extremely difficult. If I'm citing 3 scholars, I name them, but I can't name all their books and their subtitles of the books and all of that, because that takes up word space. There were challenges like that.
But you've also turned your columns into a book.
I compiled most of them. Yeah. Because what I often
did was... Did
you
you
add
add footnotes at that stage? Or?
I've added sources, but not footnotes. Because what often happened is, because it was 1,000 words, I'd often write it at 2,000 words, and then edit it down to 1,000 words. So the 2,000 word version
is there on your computers.
That's what I've put in the book, because I thought I'd put the longer versions in the book, because that's what was written first. But then it's not always easy. And I did know lots of people warned me about the perils of writing a column on history, because, what if people start taking you less seriously? Where are the footnotes and things like that? But, I thought the idea is to bring it out to a mass audience. By naming those 3 scholars in column, perhaps people who are reading it will go and pick up those books and look up those scholars and engage with their work. So you do it with a sense of hope.
Vikram, do you feel the landscape changing? Do you feel that there is now more openness to non-fiction and more understanding of what you're trying to do?
I guess so.
You've been at it, what, 10 years now?
I guess so. I mean, I think all the top chartbusters nowadays are fiction books, non-fiction books, which is a nice departure. The other trouble, since we're talking about storytelling, is when a book on history gets adapted to some other medium, and I'm facing that trouble right now on two counts. One is, of course, my book on Gauhar Jan just got adapted to a play by Lilet Dubey, and Mahesh Dattani and I had huge fights trying to, script the whole narrative for a play. So from a book to a play, like Manu mentioned about a column, I think these other mediums are equally interesting and important. In fact, one of my film deals actually fell through with a very famous filmmaker who shall remain unnamed, because he wanted to introduce a text of Gauhar Jan having an affair with the British sound recordist who came to record. Said that would be the meat of the whole film, and that's all that people are going to come to see this for. But since I'd already signed up saying I'm going to be the period consultant who will be consulted and have the last word, I refuse to let my muse be contaminated, so to say, by such extraneous stories. So now currently it's actually Ashutosh Gowarikar who is making a film on this, and it's a huge challenge then to also considering. Sorry?
I say, have you filled film rights? No. Yes, I have.
Yeah. So considering, we've seen what happened with Bajirao, Mastani, and Padmavat, and Panipat, and all of that. So history, when it also appears on screen, and I completely agree with what Parvati said, where it's an irony where on the one hand we as a country lack any regard or respect for history. We let monuments crumble. We don't have any respect for documentation. But then we take characters of the past so much to heart, and it's so difficult. Why can't we allow Bajirao to be a normal human being who also can have an affair with a woman? Why do they have to be so holier than thou, who cannot have any trace of human vices or lust or any of those, and they have to be sanctified and sanitized into something that we can't relate to? I think that also becomes a problem. And so currently having a little bit of a tussle even with Ashutosh Gowarikar, who's going to be making this film on Gauhar Jan, saying and it's a new medium to work with, screenplay writing, to see how your book and 4 years of nibbling with mosquitoes nibbling at your ankles actually converting and seeing it on screen. And I think that's a different high which comes around.
Manu, you've also sold film rights.
For the Ivory Throne, but that's going to be a web series, most probably. That's what they've announced. Really? But the thing is that, I have a slightly different take from Vikram, which is that...
To who? I mean, Netflix or...?
I don't know who they're working with. It's the people who made the movie Bahubali. So they've got the resources to make this in a big way, and of course, the queens are not going to fly through the air and do martial arts or any of that. It's going to be a different kind of thing, but yeah, it's going to be a web series. So I'm assuming that means that they will give it the treatment it deserves without adding sex scenes.
Martial arts. We definitely need martial arts in that.
No, well, better than sex scenes actually. I mean, that's what gets people really upset. But the thing is, I know they've all my book talks about it. But the thing is, I'm pretty much taking a hands-off view on this, which is that I've told them whenever you want, you can ask me whatever you want, but I'm not getting involved in the process because I don't want to have to deal with screenplays and all of that. Vikram is clearly enthusiastic about it. I know my task is simple. I'm going to do my books. I'm going to focus on my writing. I'm not going to get into film and all of this or write the script or any of that.
I'm with you on that. I think they're two different things. Yeah. I think your book needs to be completely accurate if you're writing non-fiction. You cannot say it was a sunny day when Bajirao walked out onto the pavilion unless you actually have evidence that it was sunny rather than a cloudy day. And you have to be totally strict with yourself. But a film is different.
And besides,
and if they want to go and take your source material and have spectacular sex scenes with British sound recordists,
that's reasonable because they're the experts. They're the ones who know the medium. They know how it needs to come up on screen. I can't visualize my own story in the way they might. That's not my job. So I'm more than happy to let them do it. And I mean, in a way, it's good for me also. Distances me from any kinds of controversies that emerge from the audiovisual version of it. Because I can say, look, that's not what my book says. So I'm not directly involved with that. So I think it works out well for both parties.
Just before we open it to questions, we've got another 12 minutes. I would love all the panelists just to say what their next project is going to be. Do you want to start, Parvati?
So the next is the father of Jahangir, that is Akbar. Very different, much more complicated, much less easy to get a grip on.
And didn't write an autobiography, and didn't write at all.
Didn't write an autobiography, but had this, sort of had geography written of him, which again you have to unpeel all the layers off because
it's quite irritating. Abul Faisal.
It is, but I find, I think the earlier translation, the translator is irritated. I'm reading the new one now, Thaxton's. It's far less irritating. I think Thaxton himself isn't bristling at every line, unlike Rogers, Beveridge rather.
Well, I've just come out with another 700-page tome on a very contentious figure who's also the man of the season, Savarkar, his biography, and this is the first part of a 2-volume biography. In fact, I wanted to make it a 3-volume biography because there was so much material on him which has never been accessed, and largely material which sits outside India in the archives in the UK, in France, Germany, teeming with information about this man who is calumnized day in and day out, and also eulogized by his proponents. But then very little has been written about him, known about him in all these years. So I wanted it as a 3-volume biography, and Penguin, my publisher, said this is not Amish's trilogy, which is going to keeps running off the shelf. So you need to limit it to 2. And we also told Ram Guha to restrict his biography on Gandhi to 2. So we have to have that parity with Savarkar. So I'm now with volume 1 off my back, the more complicated volume, which is volume 2, which takes a story from 1924 to 66, which covers all the controversial aspects of his life.
And have you had any more effigies burnt this time, or?
So far, no, but I'm foreseeing a lot. My crystal ball gazing shows
next week at the Jaipur Festival, we'll produce some effigies of you.
In fact, I reviewed a Vikram Savarkar book and I got some flack for saying some things in it. I mean, what is the job of a book critic? I mean, especially if it's non-fiction, you're looking at whether the archives have been touched, whether it does justice to the kind of material that's out there, whether the tone is even and more or less balanced, and whether there's critical analysis of the text. So that's the parameter. Those are the parameters with which a critic works. My job is not to sit in moral judgment on Savarkar when I'm doing a book review. They said, no, how can you say this about him? How can you say he could have, gone down a certain way if something had happened a certain time, etc., etc. And I said, that's not the job of a book critic. In terms of what I'm working on next, I've done the research a little bit like your style, which is to collect all the material first. I've got all of it. Now I need to digest it and then get to a stage where I actually sit down and write.
You're phenomenally quick, though, Manu. You're the quickest of all of us. I mean,
no, this one's been. This one's been in the works since 2012. I did the first chunk of research when I was really annoyed with the Ivory Throne when I was writing that. So I took a break from that and started researching this other thing.
Can you give us a hint on what it's about?
No, I won't, because I'm superstitious. Until something's written, I don't talk about it.
The evil eye. Lots of jealous writers, I'm sure, in the audience. Anyway, over to you guys. We have, I think, how long? Could you move your head, madam, just for 1 second, so we can see what the
we have 8
timer
minutes
says?
And 49 seconds.
So we've got 10 minutes. Gentlemen, yeah. Good. I'm enjoying it after the heat of the cold of Delhi. No? We have a spare microphone on the stage. How many have we got? We've got 2 here. Got 2, yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for this session. So most of us start reading or studying history from the social studies syllabus in our schools, and sadly, it's very one-sided. I feel it is very one-sided. So in a gist, it's Mahatma Gandhi came from South Africa and won us the independence sort of syllabus. But what I've read or understood or heard is that the history of, let's say, our partition or the wars that happened between India and Pakistan is taught different in India and in Pakistan. Like, we blame them, they blame us, and that is how it goes.
And everyone blames the British.
Yeah. So, yeah, probably united there. But then, while we try to understand and accept different narratives, I feel that this sort of one-dimensional approach to history is the first breeding ground for hatred among Indians and Pakistanis. And we end up, like, by the age of, by the age of 15, 16, when we study our independence, we end up hating each other. So while accepting different narratives, what can be done to this situation, and how can such incidents from the past be narrated in a better understanding? Any of you can answer.
So, I think one thing is that I would say, for one thing, that in our education system or in our childhoods generally, skepticism is not a highly valued trait. People are not encouraged to question or to doubt or to say, well, no, I want to find out for myself what happened. So I think that the encouraging of skepticism is one thing that I would say, that encouraging people to ask questions, even if they are fallacious, wrong, going off in the wrong direction, whatever it is. The other thing is, I think, to understand that so in post-colonial countries, and in all countries, I think, but certainly in post-colonial countries, history is a nation-building exercise, in the sense that all endeavors are working towards building the nation. So, for example, it's not a surprise that in our history, we have three greats. We have Ashoka, Akbar, and the Mahatma, and all of them, the link that joins them is their syncretic secular character, the sort of the building of all communities of the nation, gluing them together. So certainly there is that spirit that runs through our history, and you may say that there's something naive about it. On the other hand, at the point that we are now, we seem to be going in a completely different direction, looking into the past, as a way of extracting revenge upon it, in the present. And that, to me, is just a way of kissing our future goodbye. There is, so certainly, yes, I think some kind of balance is very badly needed.
I agree completely with what Parvati said, and I think what George Orwell had said, he who controls the past controls the future, and I think even the present. And that's why politicians of all hues have understood that this is a very important tool which they can use to control minds for the future. Now, I think another very problematic area which I see when it comes to Indian historiography is and in our textbooks, as you mentioned, large parts of India don't even find a mention, in our books. South of India is hardly, worth much of a mention. It's so Delhi-centric. The Northeast, we don't even know about the Ahom dynasty, which probably ruled for 600 plus years. Didn't the Northeast do nothing in the 2,000, 3,000 years of the Indian civilization? Did South of India, other than some, stray reference to the Cholas or maybe Vijayanagar and so on, what would all of us in the South doing? Along with that, I think when contemporary politics intrudes historiography, there is a conscious attempt either to, as Parvati said, seek revenge, or also to whitewash certain darker aspects of our history. Now, I say this time and time again that, whatever excesses have happened in our long and fractured history, invasions, destruction, genocides, killings, etc., the albatross of that does not and need not and cannot hang on the necks of a modern young Muslim man or woman. But and conversely, by the same logic, whitewashing that with an attempt to with this futile attempt to think that is going to create unity between communities and it is going to harm national integration. If you talk about those darker aspects, I think that's a very facile kind of an argument, because world over you have you've had it in South Africa too. You have had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You heal the wounds of the past. There is a closure then. There are no wounds to fester. On the other hand, if you ignore that, or if you deny the very existence of these things, I think that becomes a problem, and then the wound just keeps festering under that, and it's just waiting for some other politician to exploit that, and it bursts open. And I think that is exactly what is happening in our country. What can we do? I don't think the governments on any side at least the Congress governments had outsourced the entire Indian historiography to the left in their large.
In the sense, though, that there was no right to outsource it to at that point. All the historians were of the left in the 50s.
Yeah, true. There were no so-called right-wing historians because they were never given an opportunity to thrive, and careers were destroyed if you had a alternative viewpoint. But then this current dispensation too does no great justice to history, because you had, I think, the previous HRD minister Javadekar, who very proudly said we haven't changed a single page in our history books. Now, so I don't know whether followers of the BJP would probably scoff at him for that, because that is an important project for the BJP to also rewrite history. I think it's best left to people like us who are independent historians, objective historians who can write these books. Forget the textbooks. Anyway, no one's reading textbooks. So let us read because I remember almost all my history classes, I think I spent outside the class kneeling down because I just didn't know whether Jahangir, even now I don't know who succeeded whom, was Jahangir before or after Shah Jahan. And it just doesn't matter at all. And my history teachers perhaps had many a minor heart attack when she realizes that now I'm termed as a historian across India. But so let these textbooks let them be the way they are, because the minute you depend on political patronage, on NCERT and all of these people, the inherent bias and the political agendas would come through. I think the idea is you have fresh crop of young writers, old writers, whatever, who are revisiting Indian history in a modern perspective, and that probably gives us much more insight into our past than all our NCERT textbooks put together.
There's a very interesting question about the way that each generation has to look at history anew in the light of their own experience. I'll give you one example from my work. In 1774, the East India Company went bankrupt. It had milked Bengal dry during the famine, and there was simply nothing left to exploit, to loot. And the company share price disappeared, and the company went bankrupt, but the British state bailed it out in 1774. Now, this is an episode that you find almost never mentioned in the old history books, because in the end it didn't matter. The East India Company came back from the brink. It didn't bankrupt itself. But in our own time, with the subprime collapses and the way that Lehman Brothers and so on collapsed and had to be bailed out, suddenly it seems an incredibly contemporary moment. This, in a sense, is the most interesting moment in the 18th century. That like the banks 10 years ago, the East India Company suffered this catastrophic failure, followed by a national bailout. And so something which was of no interest 20, 30 years ago to historians and seemed to be irrelevant, suddenly seems to be the most relevant and interesting thing in the whole history of that century. Question at the back, and then this lady here. We have maybe just one question. This lady here, if you could ask it quickly. Yeah, you've got a microphone. Microphone here, and then we'll end it after this. As quickly as you can. Quick question, quick answer.
Hello. Yeah. So my question is basically about crafting the narrative whenever we're talking about history. So I wanted to ask everyone, just how do you decide what to keep out and what to keep, keep in? Because while you're researching, everything seems fascinating to you.
Manu? You answer that?
No, everything is very interesting, but not everything makes for a fascinating narrative.
Right.
In the sense that you're always aware of what you're going to finally produce for the reader. I make copious use of my footnotes. There are essay-length footnotes where I put all these extra interesting bits and pieces, but I won't sort of weigh down the main narrative with everything I find, because the idea is not to sort of regurgitate what you see in the archives and sort of put it on paper. The idea is to construct a tone, give it a structure, that's the idea of storytelling. That's why we do good writing also, along with good research.
Thanks.
Very quick. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful session.